The Czech Republic, Slovakia. Both beautiful countries, maybe countries you'd like to visit currently. But it wasn't always like this. It was different then. These two countries used to be united. It used to be one big state within the European nation, ruled by the Soviet Union. It used to be a nice place up until its downfall. This is the tale of Czechoslovakia. Hello everyone. My name is Austin, and this is my video on the unfortunate case of the Prague Spring, which led to the Soviet invasion on Czechoslovakia. Since the end of World War II, Czechoslovakia had been a communist country under the jurisdiction of the Soviet Union. Their population had been suffering from the lack of freedom. They had no freedom of speech, and the press was censored. The Czech economy had also been so powerless because the USSR controlled almost the entire of their economy for their personal benefits. This is what sparked it all. January 5th, 1968. Alexander Dubček is elected as the new communist leader of Czechoslovakia. Dubček had been listening to the complaints from the citizens, the issues with no freedom and the declining economy. He had a plan. April 5th, 1968. The Czechoslovak Communist Party publishes an action program to solve these issues. This plan was called Socialism with a Human Face, and it was led by Dubček himself. This plan would still allow the Soviet Union to maintain political power despite silently diverting away from communism. The plan was to explore the ideals of socialism, which had been dormant for the past 2 decades due to the Soviet Union favoring communism. Under communism, there is no such thing as private property. All property is communally owned, and each person receives a portion based on what they need. A strong central government controls all aspects of economic production and provides citizens with their basic necessities, including food, housing, medical care, and education. By contrast, under socialism, individuals can still own property, but industrial production, or the means of generating wealth, is communally owned and managed by a democratically elected government. Socialism with a human face was Alexander Dubček's attempt at making a more flexible society, in ways such as economic, political, and cultural, giving freedom of speech by eliminating press censorship and allowing citizens to travel in and out of the country to boost the declining economy. The plan seemed to have been working, and it was quite flawless. Everyone was happy in Czechoslovakia. However, soon the Soviets took notice. In Moscow, Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the USSR at the time, began to grow suspicion after his spies had told him about Alexander Dubček's plans. When he found out that Dubček had been planning to liberate Czechoslovakia, he became furious and ordered 500,000 troops from the Warsaw Pact to invade Czechoslovakia. The Warsaw Pact was an alliance made between European nations by the Soviet Union. These countries included Albania, Poland, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, and surprisingly Czechoslovakia. The purpose, according to the Soviets, was as a defensive alliance. However, it will soon become clear that the primary purpose of the pact was to reinforce communist dominance in Eastern Europe. A possible reason to why the Soviets acted so fast was because if Czechoslovakia had successfully regained their control and freedom, other nations currently occupied by the Soviets would be inspired to do the same. Therefore, when Brezhnev became aware of socialism with a human face, he declared that the USSR would not allow the countries of the Warsaw Pact to reject communism ever again, regardless of whether it would involve a Third World War. 20th of August, 1968. Soldiers and tanks show up in Czechoslovakia, invading from the northwest all the way to the south of the country. "137 Czechoslovak civilians were killed, and Alexander Dubček was arrested and flown to Moscow for trial the very next day." August 26, 1968. The Soviets have again gained control over Czechoslovakia. Life continues as it did before, cruelly. Although their attempts were eventually stopped, it was a great attempt at an unsuccessful trial to reform the totalitarian regime. Truly unfortunate. In simple words, the Prague Spring could have been avoided if the Soviet Union never had control over Czechoslovakia, or if the Soviet Union would have been kinder to the Czechoslovakian citizens. Now that we have seen both sides of the story, let's see some propagandas. This is a propaganda from the Czech. It clearly shows a lady holding a piece of cloth and presenting the words, You couldn't get laundry detergent, but you could get your brain washed. It is to convince the Czech to open their eyes, to see what the Soviet Union had been blinding them for. They wanted each other to come to a realization that they were not free, but they were under the control of the Soviets. Unfortunately, there are no official propagandas made by the Soviets. Rather than finding one and claiming it to be about this event, I have restrained myself from doing so. This is a primary source from Peter Schellest. In this top-secret letter, he tells the Czech Communist Party that they are far off better doing business interactions with the West instead of the Soviets. This is a first-hand account of a Ukrainian living in Czechoslovakia agreeing to Dubček's plan to stir away from the Soviets. This was important as we are able to see how the citizens were acting and feeling then. This second primary source is a conversation among the Czechoslovak Communist Party leaders regarding functions and positions within the military a day before Alexander Dubček was elected. Within these conversations, they discussed going against the current leader of Czechoslovakia, Antonin Novotný, who was the one before Alexander Dubček. They planned that they would betray him and elect a new leader, in which they did do so. They elected Dubček the very next day. From an article I read, it was claimed that Antonin Novotný was very pro-communist and would never betray the Soviets. This was important as we got insight onto what the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was planning to do in the first place. It was to elect someone who would turn their backs on the Soviets. From the way I have perceived the information, I stand my ground along with the Czechs. The Prague Spring, though a failure, was a good attempt by the Czechs to liberate themselves. Of course, the mass deaths were a huge problem. However, ultimately, a sacrifice would have been worth the result. Unfortunately, in this case, that sacrifice did not end up becoming anything but a loss. The entire time, the Soviets had been using the Czechs for their own benefits by using their crops and people and so forth. It was always the Soviets who had manipulated the Czechs. And I think they are to be wronged for this. Because even in the end, ultimately, the Soviets benefited by taking control again of Czechoslovakia. Along with taking the country over, the Soviets proved to all European nations that they were still a major powerhouse with the power to still consolidate their political power. I would say that the Soviet Union was the one to blame here. If they had never taken control of Czechoslovakia, then none of this would have ever occurred. And if they still chose to rule over Czechoslovakia, the least they could do is give freedom to the citizens, because nobody enjoys being lied to every single day of their lives. Thank you.